today we have a guest with us, and it is my honor to have my coffee on Zoom with Julian Reid from University of Lapland, Finland. And before we begin with the topic, that is actually oxytocin and its role in political and social life of human beings, we will just begin from a brief introduction from Julian. Yes, Julian.
Sure. It's my pleasure to be here, Azir, and join you on your YouTube channel. Okay. So my name is Julian Reid, and I'm a professor. I teach international relations in the Faculty of Social Science at the University of Lapland, which is the northernmost university in Finland, and I think it's the northernmost university in the whole of the European Union still. I began my career in my native country of the United Kingdom, but I spent my whole career teaching international relations, and I wrote a PhD in the field of politics and IR. And one of the things which I've always been intrigued by and writing about to some extent, it's not always been at the very center of my research, but it's always been a kind of a way of sourcing my approaches, is this relationship between politics and the life sciences. And by that I mean the roles and the influences which ideas and concepts and arguments and theories deriving from the life sciences, especially biology, have on the field of politics, and the ways in which they affect and play into power relations and the strategies of states, and the ways in which states and other powerful entities in world politics attempt to govern, as well as the ways in which they fight and pursue conflicts between themselves and peoples. And originally this research stemmed therefore from the research that I was doing back in the days of my PhD, which was a PhD written about the theory of war. So in my very first book, which stemmed from my PhD, it was called the Biopolitics of the War on Terror. I was researching how specifically liberal approaches to warfare have been shaped and made possible by ideas and concepts, as well as technologies flowing from the life sciences, and vice versa also, the way in which warfare has shaped the historical development and contemporary power and influence of ideas and theories, but also technologies emerging from these particular kinds of science. And so I think what we're going to talk about today relates very much to that. But yeah, in the process of growing and changing as an academic and as a researcher, my research focus shifted somewhere around 2009, 2010. It shifted a little bit from the focus on war to the focus on this, what at the time was a completely new concept in international relations of resilience. Today, resilience is part of the lingua franca of international relations. It's a concept which is used and discussed and implemented across a wide range of different kinds of science, and especially social science. But back in around 2009, 2010, it was a fairly under-researched or unresearched even concept in IR. And I was fascinated by what it meant and what it implied. And resilience in IR generally and basically tends to refer to the abilities of peoples and communities, as well as entire states, to cope with and to recover from disasters, all manner of kinds of different disasters, but especially kind of what used to be called natural disasters, like floods or hurricanes or extreme weather events, as they're sometimes referred to, but also political disasters and strategic disasters, like, for example, 9/11, terrorist attacks. How do societies and peoples and communities bounce back and recover from the trauma of terror attacks? And so that's been the focus of my research over the last 15 years, I would say. I've written a couple of books at least about resilience. One was called Resilient Life, The Art of Living Dangerously. It was published in 2014 and written with a friend of mine called Brad Evans. And another one is called the Neoliberal Subject, Resilience, Adaptation, and Vulnerability, which was published in, I think, 2016. And I wrote that also with a colleague called David Chandler. But yeah, as I've developed my research in this new field of resilience, I've gradually, just over the last year or so, become interested in what's being done with this concept of resilience and this analysis of resilience beyond the social sciences, beyond international relations, and especially in these life sciences and neurosciences, especially, and particularly neurobiology, because when we look at these sciences, we also see a lot of interest in what resilience is and also how to build it. And as I've been reading in these sciences, what I've been struck by is the kind of vast difference, conflict even, between the kind of approach that we take in social science towards resilience and the kind of approach which they take towards resilience in neurobiology and the wider neuroscience. Because in neurobiology, this ability to be resilient is seen and looked at and analyzed in a more or less completely uncritical light. So neurobiologists are simply interested in how we can understand where the resilience of human life comes from, and how we can develop it further. And this is very much in contrast to the kind of approach which I've taken towards resilience and my colleagues largely take towards resilience in international relations, where we have been much more critical of the rise of this concept. Because one of the major, most fundamental critiques of the role of the concept of resilience in international relations is that it's a way for powerful states, and especially neoliberal states, to kind of pass the buck of responsibility for care and security onto peoples themselves. So the more we talk about resilience in international relations, the more we seem to be talking about the ways in which political power, governments expect people, individuals and communities to be able to bear the brunt of suffering and trauma and damage by themselves. So, you know, when an extreme weather event occurs, or when a terrorist attack occurs on a people, when the state talks about resilience, generally what it's saying is that people themselves, individuals and communities, have to be able to show the ability to cope and not expect the state to help them or protect them from the impact of those attacks. So whereas in social science, we see resilience as a very political concept and problem, in the life sciences and in neurobiology, they see resilience simply as something very positive and something which they want to build and increase. So I'm interested in understanding, therefore, the nature of the challenge which neurobiological approaches to resilience might be seen to pose for social science. Because of course it would be really easy for me as a social scientist simply to dismiss these neurobiological approaches to resilience as kind of elements of the ideology, let's say, of neoliberalism. You know, and this is an argument which it's quite easy to find actually in social science. The argument goes that neurobiology is simply an ideological science. It provides the arguments, the theories, the concepts, the discourses on which a neoliberal state and a neoliberal approach to governance thrives. So the more the neoliberal state wants people to be self-sufficient, self-reliant and resilient, the more it's able to use these discourses and ideologies deriving, and concepts like resilience, deriving from the neurobiological sciences to legitimate their policies and approaches. So the approaches of social scientists towards neurobiology tend to be very skeptical, dismissive even of their worth. Nevertheless, there are movements, though, within the philosophy of science and even within the social sciences, which suggest that this kind of traditional social scientific dismissal of neurobiology is wrong, and that there's something of worth to be derived from these sciences and the discoveries that they are making about the neurobiological makeup of human life, as well as every other form of life. And I want to engage neurobiology, therefore, on resilience with a view to trying to get beyond the easy traditional dismissals of neurobiology, which tend to be produced by social science. And it's in that context that I've become really interested in the science around this stuff, which the neurobiologists call, name, and identify as oxytocin. Because in neurobiology, oxytocin is seen to hold the key to human resilience.
Thank you. It is a detailed introduction of what is your research and how you worked on it. You just mentioned a book, The Art of Living Dangerously.
Yes.
And that made me think that for last 3 years, because I am working on social resilience, and I am working on art of living together. It seems like with this oxytocin, we are moving towards science of living together. So how do you see these discoveries have impact on our social lives?
Okay, yeah, good question. Let me say a little bit then about what oxytocin is, and then I'll try to unpack what its implications are for our social lives and for politics as well. So oxytocin is this 9 amino acid neuropeptide, which is apparently synthesized deep within our brains, and then it's released into the brain and the bloodstream. So it circulates throughout our bodies. And it's something which is found apparently in all vertebrate species. But we've only known about it, or I say we, neurobiologists, scientists, have only known about it for a little more than 100 years or so. Its discovery goes back to the very early 20th century. It was discovered, I think, in 1906 by a doctor and scientist who identified its role in the contraction of the uterus. So the incredible phenomenon of childbirth, is something which is only possible because of the role of oxytocin in the body of the childbirthing person. And this was something which was discovered in 1906. And then very quickly after that, it was discovered also to have an important role in the production of milk, in breastfeeding following birth. So it's something which is fundamental to biological life and reproduction. Mid-20th century, it's the amino acid sequence of oxytocin was discovered by, I think, a Nobel-winning scientist. And then after that, the scientific understanding and knowledge of its role in the affective life, which also means, of course, the social life of humans and other animals, has been nothing short of immense, really, such to the point that today it's identified by scientists as being absolutely essential to life and well-being of humans. So things like our abilities to bond, form social bonds, which depend also, of course, on our capacities to trust, to feel trust and generate trust, love even, this immense ability and power and also need and interest of human life depends very much upon the role of oxytocin and other more complex affective experiences and capacities like happiness, but also very fundamental biological ones like sexual function, orgasm, But attachment and monogamy, all of these phenomena which we readily recognize as being absolutely essential to our life and social well-being, as well as biological and individual well-being, are tied to the role of oxytocin in our bodies, the science says. So there's immense interest in exploring this stuff. One neuroscientist who I've learned a lot from reading her work is named Ruth Feldman. And if you're interested in reading about this topic, then I warmly recommend her articles. Many of them are available open access, and she publishes a lot and contemporarily. But she argues that the oxytocin system must have developed as much as 500 million years ago. You know, it's incredible to think, to try to think back in evolutionary terms as long ago as that. And that gradually it became incorporated into labor and lactation of the body, and that it's transmitted from mothers to infants via this also incredible substance of human milk. And this process of the transmission of oxytocin from mothers to infants via milk has been found to be crucial, therefore, also subsequently to the resilience of the offspring. So there's a lot to be said and still researched about the role of breastfeeding, perhaps, or at least of human milk, in feeding if we believe that resilience is indeed a biological capacity, then the resilience of human life. But it's also seen to be crucial for things like neuroplasticity, the malleability and adaptability of our brains, our sociality, but also crucially for the theory of resilience, our abilities to adapt to suffering, which is what the whole theory of resilience, of course, comes down to, this capacity of human beings to adapt to the experience of suffering and get through suffering, recover from trauma. These key capacities, so central to the theory and analysis of resilience, depend, the neuroscientists argue, on the role of oxytocin in our brains and our bodies. It's also seen to be key to the whole evolutionary story of the success of the human as a species. Edward Wilson, who's now dead, another very famous biological theorist, argues exactly this, that we wouldn't have succeeded as a species to achieve the place that we have in this world without the role of oxytocin in generating our capacities for trust and for love and happiness. And what I think he talks about is our openness to the stranger, you know, this capacity to form social bonds. It's very much about the role of oxytocin. The biologists argue is what allows the human to take its place in the world to the highest level of efficiency by overcoming setbacks and by being able to forge and reforge social bonds and work together with others and live together as a way of securing ourselves in this world. So that's what oxytocin is. But you were asking me, I think, about the role of oxytocin in the social life and in the world of politics, if we can put it like that. Well, I certainly argue. I mean, I've only published one article so far on this theory and this field of the role of oxytocin in resilience. I think I sent it to you a couple of weeks ago. It came out just recently in an Italian sociological journal. But I argue that in this sense, oxytocin may well be seen to be or to become what I call the elixir of the liberal subject, the kind of magic potion, the chemical substance which everyone either does need or thinks it needs in order to be able to live a good life in the future. You know, if we buy into this science, these discoveries, then it would seem that oxytocin is absolutely essential to our capacities to live a good life. Who doesn't want to live a life without trust without love, without happiness, without sexual fulfillment. All of these things which we readily understand as being essential to our well-being would seem to rely on this stuff. But I think also the connections which the neuroscientists are identifying between oxytocin and resilience as a social and political capacity mean that everyone is going to be expected to need resilience in the future. And if states want to build resilience and to make societies more resilient in the future, then they're also going to be looking at how to generate the resilience of people individually and communities, how to enable people to form and maintain also good social bonds and the ability to trust and form attachments with a view to increasing the resilience of society. These are all things which are going to be of immense interest to states. Raising oxytocin levels to transform people from being afraid of social connectivity to being able to participate in the social world without fear and in trustful and open ways. Oxytocin would seem to entail this promise of the ability to open people up and to render us more generous towards others and make us also more emotionally fit for social bonds and for society itself, also for the pleasures of social bonds. And in fact, already there are stories circulating. I haven't been able to confirm this myself through experience, but one can read and hear stories circulating in social media and on podcasts about people using oxytocin at parties, ingesting it through nasal sprays to enhance their bonds with others. It's used recreationally at parties already in combination with the older, more traditional drug of ecstasy, or MDMA, which has been around, of course, since the 1980s on the party circles in Europe, but which is also oxytocin based. And we can see already the appeal, the attraction around oxytocin building in popular culture. So the very famous and high earning and critically acclaimed pop singer and music maker, Billie Eilish, she has a track on one of her albums. It's a very popular track. It's called Oxytocin itself. So it's already got this resonance and appeal socially for the young and for society at large, and also for states as well as science. And there's a question. The obvious question, therefore, is, scientifically, is neurobiology then the answer to all manner of different kinds of political problems today? And how do we see the potential of this science and these discoveries in social scientific terms? Because if we believe this, if we believe that oxytocin is the source of trust and love and happiness, then surely the promise of the good life for everyone is only round the corner. And surely we can solve fundamental, long-standing, historical, deep, structured political problems and sources of immense unhappiness and suffering for people, like, for example, violence, war, even poverty, racism, xenophobia. These are all things maybe which are touched upon and can be tackled through raising the oxytocin level of society. And certainly we're entering into a very new era of positivity, definitely in the neurosciences themselves, concerning the abilities to increase well-being and increase the resilience of people. And neurobiologists already want to use this knowledge and the technologies it can produce to solve what are essentially seen, or what have essentially been seen historically, as social scientific problems: political violence, poverty, racism, even climate change. These are all problems which are traditional to social science, and they're all said to be impacted by neuroscience and what it has discovered about oxytocin, to the extent that it could be argued that life science, neuroscience, is now threatening to overhaul the social sciences, the explanatory and explanatory power and the capacity to provide solutions to these problems. As a social scientist, though, I also argue that we need to question these claims and rationales. We wouldn't be doing our job, of course, as social scientists without hesitating a moment about the claims being made by the neurosciences. And this is something which I'm very well trained in doing. It goes right back to my original research 20, 25 years ago when I was interested in the relationship between war and the life sciences and the role of life science, not in solving war, but in making war possible, especially for powerful, liberal, Western states and powers. And one of the other things which I've discovered in researching this topic today here in 2024 is that this relationship between the life sciences and neurobiology and warfare, it's alive and well in context of the researching of oxytocin, because oxytocin also has another really interesting role and side to it, which is its role in violence and aggression. So there are arguments, scientific arguments, to say that oxytocin also increases the potential for violence and aggression towards particular kinds of others, particular kinds of what are seen to be outsiders to our in-group or our own society. So it may be that oxytocin has this ambivalence to it, that it increases trust and love and openness to certain kinds of strangers and others, whereas at the same time, nevertheless, potentially increasing aggression and violence and xenophobia towards other kinds of strangers. So I'm interested in unpacking that, of course. And maybe it may be that it's crucial to our abilities as certainly theorists of international relations to understand what is one of the the classical paradoxes of international relations, which is, why is it that when we look at the liberal Western world and the history and development of it during the 19th and 20th to 21st century, we see this incredible phenomenon of increasing peace between liberal states and societies and security, while at the same time, nevertheless, being able to observe increasing violence and aggression towards other states and other societies and other civilizations, which are seen to fall outside of the orbit of the liberal West, right? This is a classical paradox of international relations theorists. And, the liberals say that it's all about building democracy and extending civilization to the non-Western world, spreading Western ideas, etc. But other more critical thinkers like myself say, no, there's something wrong here, because these liberal ideas, which you see as the solution, are actually inciting violence and aggression between different states and peoples who, for their very own good reasons, don't necessarily agree that liberalism has the answers politically to what constitutes the right kind of polity, the role of religion in social life, all manner of different kinds of big political and philosophical and religious questions. So, yeah, I think we have to be wary of the discovery. I'm interested and intrigued, and I want to explore the potential of this new line of research in neurobiology and these discoveries for our problems in social science, but I'm also wary of this discovery and its abilities to solve these problems, especially when it comes to issues of war and violence, because I'm troubled by the interest, especially of very powerful Western states, in funding and providing the rationales for the research which is being done in neuroscience around oxytocin.
Before we go to the war and other things, I am just because we talk about strangers, so it is very interesting that being a stranger and perceiving a stranger, it is a more social or political category. It does not fall anywhere under science, because science usually thinks another way. Particularly when we talk about liberalism, So for a liberal person, or for a liberalism system of liberalism, a conservative is a stranger or an alien. I mean, if I just assume it, and vice versa. So usually when we talk about this term stranger or being a stranger or perceiving a stranger, it also connects somewhere to racism.
Mm,
Because racism sometimes because being stranger mean being different, and
yeah,
being different can then exploited in racism. So how do you see
absolutely.
this? I'm being cautious about the use of oxytocin. How do you see
Mm.
it connected with the problems like racism?
I mean, the fact is that there's incredible confidence in the neurosciences and neurobiology as to the potential of oxytocin research and its raising to change, at the very least, change the problem of racism and reduce racism. And, it's fascinating to read this kind of research from a political social scientific perspective, and interested as we are in understanding the very deep complexities of where racism comes from, different forms of racism, changing forms of racism. It goes without saying as a social scientist that racism is a historical and social category. It's different across space and time. It's deeply, deeply complex. There are many different forms of it contemporarily. It's continually changing. It changes with our understanding, right? We can't have enough understanding of what racism is and where it comes from and its differences. It's deeply complex. And I don't think within the social sciences generally we talk even about solving racism. That would be hubris to think that one could solve racism. It's deeply ingrained socially and politically. But in the neurosciences, they seem to think that they can directly impact racism. You can take a person and change their outlook, their sensory and affective relationship to other bodies, racially coded, through raising their oxytocin levels. So really fascinating research experiments where they take a group of people, sort of measure their relative racism towards another group in one or another way by showing them faces, for example, take a group of Israelis, for example, and show them a series of different faces, and then measure how the biology of the person changes in response to the racially encoded face, for example. But it's fascinating stuff. But yeah, I think we have to be very careful with this kind of way of thinking and approaching racism itself, and how and where we think we know that racism exists, and how we think we can measure or identify it. Because we know as being, I, like you, I live in a society where effectively I'm a foreigner. But if we were to compare and you too, you live in Sweden, I live in Finland, we're outside of our native countries and societies and cultures, but to very different extents and different ways. And I could talk about my experience of racism here in Finland as a person hailing from the United Kingdom. You could talk about your experience of racism as a person living in Sweden and hailing from Pakistan. And we could compare, but nevertheless, there would be differences. And those differences would also be socially and politically mediated. So we know that racism is complex, and even where we think racism doesn't exist, it nevertheless persists. A person can be perfectly polite and responsive and generous socially, but nevertheless convey racism in all kinds of nuanced and different ways, which they may very well themselves be blind to, and to which a neuroscientist trying to measure would also quite possibly be blind to. And we need social and political analysis to help us to understand where racism exists, where we ordinarily might think it did not, right? So it's troubling to me, these claims to be able to simply solve racism or think that even that we can even see racism or measure it in the ways that the neuroscientists tend to presume that they can. But yeah, there's tremendous enthusiasm in these sciences as to their abilities to reduce xenophobia and increase what they call pro-social behaviors, for example, towards refugees. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we lived in a world where our societies were open to others seeking refuge from immense suffering and harm elsewhere? I think we would both certainly and want to live in such a world. If we could overnight change the biology of people's, intervene positively to help people to be more open in such a way, then wouldn't that be a fantastic thing? But yeah, I'm not sure that the neuroscientists understand the full depth of the problem and phenomenon of racism, but they certainly think that they can change it.
Okay, and another question that I was thinking when you talked about the parties, recreation parties, where oxytocin was used, is used to mingle up and being attached to other people. Now, there is, in social sciences, I think when we talk about ethical sensitivities, we are very sensitive about people, about their culture, about their religion, about their set of beliefs while talking to them, everything. But if we talk about oxytocin and its effect on the body, it seems like the oxytocin does not understand these cultural limits or other things. So if we try to exploit or manipulate in some way this oxytocin to decrease racism or whatever, or increase or enhance social experience and social bonding, do you think that these cultural morals and religious morals, they might be compromised?
I think it's a really important point. We are embodied subjects. Of course, we are also as social scientists. And anyway, in social science, we're taught to think one way, but maybe our experience as bodies tells us something slightly different. So, we, as social scientists, we learn about the enduring difficulties of overcoming cultural difference, political conflicts, etc., the immense complexity of society and the endless play of identities and generating social problems. But then, and I have no experience of having my oxytocin change. But what I do have experience of is, going to parties, for example, in the 1980s. So I grew up in the UK in 1980s. That was the decade of my transition from childhood into adulthood, and going to nightclubs at the end of the 1980s, especially. So I was there when this new drug of ecstasy hit the scene at the time, and people started to take these pills, and I did too. And it was amazing to experience the very positive psychic impact which this stuff has on the mind and on the body, and to also witness it in other people, and to see how open one can be potentially to forms of social bonding and relations and capacities to trust and hear and listen and simply be with others in a way that is not possible without this kind of biological intervention in the mind and in the body. So, in that respect, and I've never been to an oxytocin party, so I have no way of knowing what those are like. But of course, it's a fact that we know that this, from that kind of experience, we know that there is this potential through neurobiological interventions, self-generated or coming from the outside through medical bodies and science and experiments. It's possible to change the ways in which people relate to one another, and also very, 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 very positively, in a very, very positive way. I don't think anyone who was there at the end of the 1980s and who experienced the effect of ecstasy on on nightlife and on the club scene and parties would deny that, it was immensely positive. The 80s in Britain, it was a very violent decade socially. You had Thatcherism, the birth of neoliberalism, the immense destruction of people's lives, increasing poverty and inequality, and also hatred. There was a lot of hatred in society, racism, and immense. British society at that time. It was very violent, especially if you're a young man like I was. You were exposed to violence just by stepping outside of your house, going to school or the workplace, and certainly going out at night. You had to be really careful, and you would probably suffer some violence. There was a lot of alcohol generated violence, especially in Scotland where I was at the time. And the effect of MDMA at that time on people was, it was really wonderful. It made people much more peaceful, much more generous towards others, and much less inclined towards violence if they were not drinking alcohol and simply using this newly discovered drug of MDMA. So it doesn't, for me, as a person of social experience, I'm completely open to the fact that neurobiological interventions can change the way in which people behave and interact for the better.
Well, good. But then, well, I'm not sure if I am problematizing it more than the needs, but I am just thinking that if you think that taking that pills or medicines that can somehow work on the oxytocin level, and that can help you to give a conscious experience of accepting each other. But does this conscious experience become a part of your cognitive script, and you don't need that drugs again to build up those attachments?
That's a really important question, which I also want the answer to. So I don't understand it. I don't think the science understands at this point. So it's clear that it knows how to raise oxytocin in the moment, so to speak, temporarily. You can do this, but there are also recognized problems around how it affects the brain and the bloodstream differently. And it's possible to get it into one area of the body, but how you get it to circulate throughout the body, that's another kind of obstacle, scientific obstacle, technological obstacle, as I understand it. And like with ecstasy or any other kind of drug, what happens when it exits the body? Does the body then go into some kind of withdrawal state even? What is the day after like? These are obviously big questions. And how does one sustain one's oxytocin levels over time? How does one raise them such that they continue to be at a higher level than they were in the past? Does one have to ingest this stuff on a daily basis, or with what kind of regularity? Does one then generate dependence, etc., etc.? These are all, for me, unanswered questions, or at least questions which I haven't located answers to yet. It may well be that there are answers out there in the scientific literature. I'm, of course, a social scientist reading this stuff, so I have to really work cognitively to grasp answers as well as I can. But yeah, it would seem to me anyway that these are much more open questions and unanswered questions than some others in the field, so to speak.
And what about the other side, or we will see this thing in reverse order. For example, you see that there are religions who try to promote love and humanity, and actually they change the script of the people. Okay, all equal, we should love each other, love thy neighbor, etc. So somehow they try to change people through changing their cognitive script, and that can affect their behavior. And we also know that there are some theories, I'm not sure because I don't have a deep reading about it, that your social experiences can also affect on the level of oxytocin. I'm not sure how close it is to reality. So if I think that's So what do you think? There's another way how we can enhance our social experiences to manipulate or to exploit the level of oxytocin?
Great question.
Informative.
There's definitely a lot of research going on into the relationship of oxytocin to narratives and stories, and the ways in which different stories impact on our oxytocin levels in different ways, as well as the ways in which our oxytocin levels influence our susceptibility to certain kinds of stories and certain kinds of narratives. So, you know, one hypothesis would be religious, or one interesting area of investigation would be to look at the effects of religious narratives, or any kind of narrative, on the body and the brain, and to observe and identify and understand how the lure of a particular narrative plays upon the neurobiological constitution of the body and the oxytocin of the body. And this is something which is not only just being done, but it's also of immense interest, politically and strategically, to states and governments, as well as to defense departments, especially in the United States. So there's a lot of funding of neurobiology in the United States by, for example, DARPA, which is the major defense and research organization in the United States. They've been funding neurobiological research for a good few years now. And a lot of this research has gone into the researching into the role of narratives and the question of how oxytocin influences our susceptibility to certain narratives. Now, why is it that DARPA or the Pentagon are interested in understanding the relationship between oxytocin and narratives or stories? Well, of course, they're interested in how they can use stories, deploy stories, narrate the place and position of the United States in the world in a way that is appealing and attractive to people, and which plays upon their biological well-being in a way that seemed to be experienced as enhancive. And and also more crudely, how they can simply manipulate oxytocin such that people will find credible the kind of narratives which American power depends upon strategically and militarily in the world today. How to narrate the story of, for example, America's support of Israel in its horrific, vicious persecution of the Palestinians at the moment, for example, or how to use this knowledge in Ukraine to defeat Putin and the Russians, how to make Western support for Ukraine and aggression towards Russia part of a narrative which is more appealing to the global South, for example. We know that they're facing immense problems in selling their narrative at the moment outside of the Western world. This is part of the reason why oxytocin research is receiving so much funding today, especially in the United States, because the state and government and even the Pentagon sees it of immense utility to understand this set of relationships between oxytocin and narratives and social experience and our susceptibility to certain narratives and the impact of certain narratives on our oxytocin levels. I mean, we all have, we have the everyday experience of the effect of stories on our sense of well-being and purpose in the world. We watch movies, or we read books, or we simply listen to the stories which are told by our nearest and dearest as a way of affecting our biological well-being. We can feel the impact of those stories on our well-being. I certainly can. If I watch a good movie, I feel immediately the impact on my sense of self and place in the world. But the neuroscientists say that we can be more direct and exact about that impact and measure how it works through this medium of oxytocin as a way to connect people better, not just with their societies or with as can also be the case with religions, but with states and governments. So yeah, it's
Yeah, I am now well, I need little bit of more discussion, just little bit of more discussion about this thing, because now I'm going to, it seems like that this topic of oxytocin and its impact in social and political lives, it is somehow relatable to your early career research experiences. But now and especially about interstate warfare. But now I am going to put you back again in this US politics of oxytocin. What do you think that it can contribute in real warfares? How it can do that?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's easiest for me to unpack that or to answer that question by thinking through the potential of oxytocin to change and contribute to warfare through the lens of resilience, right? So we know that oxytocin is seen by the neuroscientists as being the source of human resilience. But how do states and armies and militaries look to deploy resilience? Well, Ukraine is really interesting and important from that perspective, because the fact is that Ukraine has been a virtual laboratory for the building of resilience, going back at least 10 years to the year 2014, which was when Russia annexed Crimea and the war began its gradual escalation towards the full-bloody conflict, which we know it to be today, and which has been raging for 2 years now. But since 2014, the United States, through the guise of NATO, has been gradually developing an interest in resilience as a kind of strategic concept, as a way of developing a framework by which NATO countries and peoples can deal with the threat of Russian attack and even invasion, as has been the case for Ukraine. And in this context, it's in this NATO-sponsored context of the development of resilience doctrine and concepts that there has been more and more support given to new research in neurobiology aimed at improving our knowledge and abilities to increase the resilience of NATO societies. So there's a recent report, for example, on the topic of human augmentation, how to augment human life and human beings, build them biologically in ways that they are not simply born into this world, equipped naturally. And this is a report which has been written by the United Kingdom and the German Defense Ministries. Its full title escapes me now, but it's a relatively recent report. But this report identifies resilience as the major source of influence for NATO states in the future. And within this context, the report talks directly and explicitly about their aims, the aims of the UK and the German defense ministries, as you know, allies of the United States and key members of NATO, to enhance human individuals within NATO societies. And within this aim of enhancing human individuals, augmenting the human, they describe this vision of what they describe as human emotional advancement, including explicitly and openly with new kinds of drugs to improve the sociability of NATO peoples, which is seen to be by defense departments as absolutely essential to the building of the kind of resilience which NATO peoples are going to need in the future in order to cope with potential Russian attack and invasion. So here we're talking especially about those peoples which are most prone to future Russian attack, right along the border with Russia. And this is, of course, incredibly relevant for me and everybody else here living in Finland, where the risk of direct conflict with Russia has been growing month by month since Finland's entry into NATO, but also the Baltic states as well. But yeah, it's really interesting to see that within this context of NATO research and investment in resilience as a concept and doctrine for the defense from Russia, we see military support for the use and role of drugs growing. Support for MDMA, for example, interest in MDMA as a drug which can open the window of human life, human individuals, both within the military and wider society, to greater and better sociability. So there's a huge interest in what they call pro-sociability, and how pro-sociability of people can be increased and manipulated with drugs such as MDMA, which act directly on the oxytocin system, because MDMA also acts on our oxytocin system, but also ways in which they can gain direct access to our oxytocin system, not necessarily through MDMA, but through other, maybe more mundane means, like these nasal sprays that I was describing otherwise. So that's definitely one element of the way in which we can see oxytocin gradually being operationalized to wage war in the Western world and by the Western world against its major enemies. But I'd like to connect that interest and that line of development militarily with some of the neuroscientific research, which has also been going into the role of oxytocin in defensive aggression, the ability of people simply to rise up and defend themselves from predatory states like Russia, and aggressive states or whatever. So there's a lot of research actually which has been done into the role of oxytocin in rats. So experiments, for example, where the scientists will take a mother rat and put that mother rat with its babies into a cage. And then what they will do as a way of conducting the experiment is to take a predator rat and put the predator rat into the cage. Now, what happens when you put a predator rat into the cage, same cage as a mother rat with its babies? Well, typically what will happen is that the mother rat will, if the predator rat is much bigger than the mother rat, she will just freeze. And then the predator rat will simply devour the babies, and the mother rat is completely helpless to do anything about that. And the reason for that is because of the way in which the nervous system freezes and the biological and psychic crisis which the rat goes into in seeing what's about to happen take place, and its sense of it being incapable of doing anything about it. It's frozen by fear. And what the scientists are interested in doing, what they do in fact in these experiments, is to see what happens when you raise the oxytocin level artificially of that mother rat. And the conclusions, the observations are really quite incredible, because these are experiments which show that when you raise the oxytocin level of the mother rat is suddenly able to overcome its fear, overcome that freezing state, and successfully fend off the predator rat. Because its oxytocin level is raised, so its connection with its babies is increased to an extent where it's able to defend itself and its life and its own offspring in a way that it's not able to when its oxytocin levels are lower, and when fear becomes the governing emotion. So I think there's going to be a lot of interest in NATO and in the United States and Western allies of the United States more generally in how oxytocin might be militarily and socially operationalized to make human beings more able to defend themselves successfully against predator states and predator militaries in the context of invasion. I mean, we can all see already how amazing the resilience of ordinary Ukrainians has been to Russian invasion, right? So Ukraine's relative success so far in defending itself from Russian invasion has depended not simply on its militaries and its abilities to conscript young men mostly into waging war and participating in the military defense, but also on the social mobilization of people, of cities, and of businesses and of ordinary people living in places of Russian occupation to participate in social resilience to Russian occupation and invasion. Without that social mobilization, that social resilience, the war would already be over in Ukraine, and Putin would have been successful. And NATO knows this, right? They understand how crucial social resilience has been to their relative success in defending Ukraine so far from Russian invasion and from Putin's aims. And this is only going to grow, and as other states, other NATO members develop their strategies of defense and preparation for future Russian attacks here in Finland and elsewhere, I can promise you, I'm absolutely certain that we will see knowledge and capacity to mobilize this science and technology with a view to enabling people to develop the right kind of neurobiological state in order to be able to defend themselves from future Russian invasion and occupation. And who knows what's coming in the future, but for sure there's going to be a lot more war and a lot more killing on the horizon, but also a lot more resilience and a lot more to be heard about the role of oxytocin in warfare.
Interesting. When you talk about the example of mother rat, it just became a deja vu for me. I remember that we talked about this example before, that if we will change the offsprings of the mother, will she react in the same way or not? I just remember that in my childhood, there was a story about a monkey, monkey, who was placed in a water tank with her young child, and then the water tank was being filled with water, and the mother monkey becomes conscious about the life of the child monkey, baby monkey, and she used to pick the child up and up. So unless she was about to drown, but the child was in her arms, and she has raised it above her head. When she was going to drown, she put that child under her feet and raised her face out of the water. So, I mean, for her life was more important in the end when she was going to die. I'm not sure if we would raise the oxytocin level of that mother monkey, she would sacrifice for her child or not. But anyhow, there are questions about it.
Yeah, hypothetically, of course, it would be a fascinating experiment. I mean, of course, in an ethical sense, it's very hard to read about these experiments on other animals, and it's hard, isn't it, to read about this stuff, learn about this stuff without, in a certain sense, being horrified by what is done to animals in the name of science and the suffering which is seen to be necessary and purposeful within science. But there's another sense in which it's immensely fascinating to read about these discoveries, and there's always also a sense of immense interest in knowing what happens when you raise the oxytocin level of a mother rat in relationship to a predator rat. And it's impossible to deny the apparent weight of importance of discovering that one can create these changes in behavior and in relationships to fear and willingness to defend oneself or one's offspring, or whomever it, as you say, and whomever it is, whether it's one's own offspring or the offspring of another, who cares really? How do we should all be interested in knowing how to defend ourselves and the vulnerable from predators, right?
You talked about social membership in Ukraine war. Do you think that this the neuroscientific technology, it can also help to enhance the sentiments of nationalism or sentiments about something like that?
I mean, yes, I think it clearly should be possible, you know, thinking about the role of narratives, going back to this role of narratives in the in the science, and thinking as a social scientist about the importance of narratives to the very phenomenon of nationalism, for example, and also just, you know, our own everyday social experience of nations and nationalism. You know, as a child, we all grow up in societies where, when we're too naive to understand better, we are lured by the appeal of national symbols and national stories and national ideology and discourse. It's only through education and learning and maturity that we learn to relate to that affective experience of nationalism upon us in a way that can be ironic or critical. Yeah, I think there's no doubt that oxytocin levels interfering and intervening in the oxytocin in certain ways, done artfully, must be potentially one way of forging attachment to a national project or national defense. Thinking about the supposed importance of oxytocin to our very abilities to forge and maintain social bonds. You know, what would nationalism be without that capacity? That very attractive and positive capacity of human beings to forge social bonds and to sustain social bonds. There is an element of every nationalism which is, in that sense, positive, right? It's constituted through sociality, often of a very limited and even violent and aggressive kind. Nevertheless, the kernel of nationalism is social, right? It depends upon the ability of subjects to forge social bonds and to identify with others who are, in some respects, different to themselves. This is the story which Benedict Anderson tells about nationalism through his brilliant work from the 20th century in a book called Imagined Communities. He talks about the role of storytelling, and then of print technologies and spreading stories and so forth, and articulation of symbols and so forth. Of course, not every nationalism is the same as another. Nationalisms are all different. In many ways, Anderson's most interesting work was not Imagined Communities, but the book which he wrote later. It's a wonderful book he wrote about Filipino nationalism in the 19th century. Is called Under Three Flags. And it's about the role of anarchism, actually, in forging the Filipino nationalism, which was able to produce the anti-colonial resistance of Filipinos to colonialism. And you know, many forms of colonialism and the relative success of anti-colonial projects would have been very difficult without some kind of role of nationalism for colonized nations in fighting back against Western colonial nationalism.
And coming back to these narratives and stories, for example, the current situation in Palestine, there are narratives and stories of Israeli, how the armies are doing genocide in those areas. Do you think these narratives and war stories in which the Palestinians are seen as in a very bad condition, these narratives can further strengthen their nationalism?
Oh, for sure, without a shadow of a doubt. But also, all kinds of different potential movements. I mean, this is going to play out for as long as we can foresee, right? This, the extent and the viciousness of this historical moment of the violence which is being done to Palestinians from day to day. This won't be forgotten. This goes down in history for as long as we can foresee, and for different people in different ways and to different extents, of course. But in terms of the capacity to narrate the fall of the West, the fall of the liberal West, the decline of the liberal West, I think this is a really significant moment, because there's a sense in which I think they've given the blatant and flagrant American support for Israel's vicious war on Gaza and Palestinians, and the killing which has been done and continues to be done to human life in Palestine. This is going to play out for as long as we can foresee, and not to the benefit of the United States and its liberal allies. I think it's part of the story of the decline, the relative decline of the West. So in that sense, of course, it's interesting to think about how oxytocin plays out in different ways. It may well be that the West and the United States is now better able to manipulate and deploy oxytocin research and technologies in ways that are aimed at shoring up its power and preventing its decline. But there are other ways in which, there's always a limit to the stories which states can tell about themselves. And there's a limit to the viability, the veracity of every kind of nationalism or state-based ideological project. And people can always see through lies. And also people are very, very, very good at seeing evil when it's in their face, which is pretty much where we're at today in 2024, when we look at what's going on in Palestine.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, I mean, it was a topic that is new in a way, because still there are a lot of questions out of it, and we can still problematize it more. As a social scientist, we like to problematize the things when we need to understand them. But now, going towards the last question, that is actually about its interdisciplinarity. I mean, we're talking about social science and the life sciences, and we are trying to see that how the life sciences and social sciences may be seen in relation to each other. Do you think there's scope of this interdisciplinarity in future?
Definitely, without a doubt. I mean, this is so important, this topic and what's going on. It's essential that social science rises to the challenge of engaging with neuroscience and what it is discovering and what it is revealing and claiming about the human biological condition, as well as what it promises to be able to do in the future in terms of augmenting the human and intervening in human biology to change our dispositions as individuals and collectivities in the world. We can't, as a social science, we can't continue to be ignorant or blind or dismissive either of this stuff, of this science and its knowledge. We have to engage with it and do so also, I think, in a relative spirit of generosity. I don't think, it's very, as I said at the beginning, it's too easy to just, as a social scientist, dismiss this as, oh, that's just life science. That's just, they don't understand the depth of the social and political condition of the human. They don't get social science. We need social science, the social scientists say, to understand racism, etc., to understand xenophobia, to understand war. Yes, of course we need social science. And of course this is all true, but we have to work towards engaging with these sciences and these scientists and their knowledge in a way that can be productive. But we can't deny the relative truth of what is being discovered in terms of the way in which bodies respond to and change through neurobiological intervention and through our knowledge, which is still in its infancy, let's remember, of the nature of the neurobiology of the human. Let's remember that oxytocin research only goes back a little more than 100 years. When we talk about political science or political theory or international relations, classically, we narrate their existence over, within the West, at least 2,000 years. IR says it goes back to Thucydides and the Greeks and political science draws on Aristotle and Plato and so on and so forth in the Western tradition. But what we can claim in terms of changing the very nature of the problems that we deal with in social science and political science and international relations, in terms of the enduring nature of the problems of war and violence and xenophobia and racism, we can't claim very much in terms of our abilities to solve any of these problems. They're still with us, they're getting worse. So I think there's a good deal to be interested in terms of what the neurosciences and neurobiologists are doing with human life and human augmentation. We must engage, we must be interdisciplinary in one way or another, and we must get over the simple knee-jerk rejection of non-social scientific approaches to the human condition in order to be productive and have relevance also in the future.
And I also think that if social science would be there in collaboration with life sciences, social science can also help science to see what is in the best interest of the human societies, because maybe somehow science forgets the best interest of the human society. It would be a productive combination.
Absolutely. And I think, even just in our conversation together, we just by talking between the two of us, we generated potential kinds of, life scientific experiments. I mean, I wouldn't want to be the scientist who puts the mother rat in the cage with the offspring, which are not its own, in order to find out what happens vis-a-vis the predator rat. But I can see that only a social scientist, in a sense, could come up with that problem. The life science, it wouldn't occur to the neuroscientist to think of doing that, right? In the same way that it occurs automatically to you as a social scientist. You see immediately what has to be done experimentally in order to make the neuroscience more effective and have more relevance socially and politically and theoretically and philosophically. So we should be thinking about how to bring social science into the laboratory to make those kinds of experiment and knowledge better in the future. And we should also be bringing the neuroscientists into our classrooms, into our seminars, into our offices and our studies, in order to be able to think laterally about the classical problems of social science.
Perfect. Great. Thank you very much, Julian. It was a very interesting discussion, and I am sure that it is a great deal of knowledge when the people will watch it on YouTube, on my channel, Social Research. Thank you very much for joining me, and it is an honor to have you here.
It's been my pleasure, Azra. I really, really enjoyed the talk and benefited from it tremendously. So I'll take our thoughts and your ideas with me into this day and beyond.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.